Hi and welcome to this video about analysis of movements, and today we're going to be looking at different movements involved in sport. And so the first plane we need to know about is the sagittal plane, and this essentially bisects the person in two, and you can see how this plane basically cuts the person in half. And we say that if somebody's moving through a sagittal plane, then it pivots around a transverse axis. In fairness, with the types of movements you need to know about for the course, in the majority of cases they're always in the sagittal plane and they always act around the transverse axis. And we can think of these types of movements being things like flexion and extension. So this can be raising of the knee, this could be raising of the arm in terms of doing a bar curl, for instance, and that's a movement within the sagittal plane. The other two other types of plane is the frontal plane, and that pivots around a frontal axis. And so these are thought of as movements like abduction and adduction. So that's where you move, if your arm's down by your side, is where it moves outwards. And we can think of those motions, abduction and adduction, really being in the frontal plane. And the final plane is the transverse plane, and this pivots around the longitudinal axis. And this is for rotational movements, things like pronation and spination. So turning we can think of. And so the first real movement that we have to look at is running, and this can be broken down into two phases. But the plane that it moves in is sagittal, and it obviously pivots around the transverse axis. And the two joints, or the three joints that you really need to look at, are the hip, the knee, and the ankle. And so the hip, as you probably well know, is a ball and socket joint. The knee is a hinge, and also the ankle acts a bit like a hinge. And you're expected to break this down into two different aspects. So one is the drive phase. Now obviously as one leg is driving, the other is in a almost like a preparation or a relaxation phase. So we can think of this leg here like being in the drive phase, and this one here being in the relaxation phase. Now if you actually look at this person's leg here, we can look at the muscles involved. So at the hip there are two major muscles involved at the hip. One is the glutes, or the gluteal muscles, and the other is the hip flexor. Now in this position, if you look at his hip, then essentially the angle between his upper leg here and his chest, so around where his hip, essentially just above where his hip is, that angle is quite wide. And so if we looked at that angle coming around from there round to his lower leg, in this case it can actually go beyond 180, which is why this can be referred to in the drive phase as hyperextension. You can just normally refer to this as extension in most cases. And the agonist, or the muscle that's actually causing that type of movement, is called the gluteal muscles. And so whilst the glutes are contracting and putting the leg in hyperextension, then the other muscle that's involved with the hip movement, which is the hip flexor, is relaxing. The knee, if you look at the position of the knee here, then this angle that goes from the lower leg round to the top part of his leg here, this shows that the leg is in extension because it's fully straightened out. And the muscle involved in doing that, in straightening the leg out there, is the quadriceps. And so the agonist at this point is called the quadricep, and the antagonist will be the hamstrings, which are on the back here. So the agonist is contracting here, and the antagonist, which are the hamstrings, are relaxed at that point. Now the ankle, you'll notice here that his foot is pointing downwards, and this illustrates plantar flexion. Now the two muscles involved in doing this, one is the gastrocnemius and the other is the anterior tibialis. Now in order for your heels to be raised and your toes to be pointing down, then that's plantar flexion, and the muscle and the agonist for this is the gastrocnemius. So at this point the anterior tibialis is relaxed, and so you've got your three major points there. You've got the hip at this point is in hyperextension, and that's caused by the gluteal muscles contracting. You've got the knee, which is in extension, and that's caused by the quadriceps, and the ankle, which is undergoing plantar flexion because the toe is pointing down, and that's caused by the agonist, the gastrocnemius. Now there's the muscles involved in these contractions can undergo different types of contraction. One type of contraction where the length of the muscle doesn't change is called isometric. Where the length of the muscle is changing, we can refer to that as an isotonic contraction. Now there are two major types of isotonic contraction. One is called concentric. That's where the muscle length will shorten when it's undergoing contraction, and also you then have eccentric. That's where the muscle length is lengthening under contraction. You can think of the majority of muscle contractions where it's shortening. So if we look at isotonic contractions, the majority of those are concentric. You tend to find that eccentric contractions are normally done against gravity, and so what will happen is the muscle will still be under tension, but it's lengthening. So in the majority of cases here, the muscle, the major agonist, is undergoing an isotonic, and more specifically than that, a concentric contraction. So we can talk about the gluteals undergoing concentric, also the quadriceps undergoing concentric, and the gastrocnemius undergoing concentric isotonic contractions. In the test, to avoid problems, you might just refer to it as an isotonic contraction, and so to avoid confusion with concentric or eccentric. So an example of an eccentric contraction is the bicep curl, particularly when it's being extended. And so obviously holding a weight and your arm is being basically going down, you're working against gravity. There's still tension within the bicep, and so what's happening there is it's lengthening. So this can be thought of as an eccentric contraction. Now the next phase, or the next different type of section to do running, is the recovery phase, and so this represents the other leg here as it's being raised up. So the hip is now in flexion, and you'll notice that the angle between the leg and the upper body here is reduced, so it's in flexion, and the agonist for this movement is the hip flexors. At the knee, excuse me, at the knee it's undergoing flexion, because if you look at the angle between the lower leg and the upper leg, that's reduced, and so the main agonist for that is the hamstrings, which are the muscles that you find at the back of the leg here. And the ankle is now in dorsiflexion because the toes are pointing up, and the muscle involved in raising those toes up is the tibialis anterior. Sometimes they switch those words around, so anterior tibialis, and that's the muscle that you find at the front of the shin. Obviously the major antagonists at this point, so if the hip flexor is contracting, therefore the gluteals will be the antagonist. If the hamstrings are the agonist, therefore the quadriceps will be the antagonist, and if the agonist is the tibialis anterior, then the major agonist antagonist at this point will be the gastrocnemius. If you join me on the next video, I'll be looking at some other types of movement.